The death of Mr. Holridge. Mr. Thomas Holridge was, by all accounts, a most agreeable man. He had lived in Eldercombe for nearly 20 years, occupying a modest but comfortable house on the edge of the village. His habits were regular, his manner polite, and his presence so thoroughly integrated into village life that it was difficult to imagine the place without him. He was not particularly close to anyone, but he was known to everyone, and that, in a village, was often more important. It was Mrs. Wilton who first raised the alarm. She had noticed shortly after 10 o'clock that Mr. Halridge had not opened his curtains. This, in itself, might not have seemed remarkable, except that Mr. Halridge was a man of routine. His curtains were opened at precisely the same time each morning, 9 o'clock, never later. Mrs. Wilton, whose attention to such details was both habitual and precise, found this deviation unsettling. At 10:30 she mentioned it to Mrs. Carter at the grocer's. By 11 it had been mentioned again. By 15:15 concern had taken root. It was decided, after some discussion, that Dr. Elmsley should be informed. He arrived shortly thereafter, his manner brisk but not alarmed. "I am sure there is a simple explanation," he said. There usually was. The door to Mr. Harridge's house was not locked. This, too, was not unusual. In Eldercombe, doors were often left unsecured during the day. Dr. Elmsley entered, calling out as he did so. There was no reply. He found Mr. Halridge in the sitting-room, seated in his usual chair. At first glance nothing seemed amiss. There was no sign of disturbance, no indication of struggle. The room was as orderly as ever. But Mr. Halridge did not move. Dr. Elmsley approached slowly. He examined him briefly. Then he straightened. By the time he stepped outside, his expression had changed. "I am afraid," he said, "that Mr. Halridge has passed away." The word spread quickly. By midday the entire village knew. There was, of course, a certain amount of sorrow. Mr. Halridge had been liked, respected. His absence would be felt. But there was no shock, no alarm. "He was not a young man," Mrs. Carter observed. "No," Mrs. Wilton agreed, "and he lived quietly." "Yes." Dr. Elmsley, when asked, confirmed that there was no immediate cause for concern. "Likely natural causes," he said. "Quite peaceful, by the look of it." And so, the matter began to settle. Funeral arrangements were discussed. Practical considerations took precedence. Our life, as it always did, moved forward, and yet not everyone was entirely satisfied. Miss Marple arrived in Eldercombe 2 days later. Her visit had been arranged some time in advance. She had come at the invitation of an old acquaintance, Mrs. Denham, whose cottage overlooked the village green. It will be quite restful, Mrs. Denham had written. Miss Marple had agreed. She appreciated restful places, but by the time she arrived the village was no longer quite as it had been. "Oh, my dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Denham said as she welcomed her inside, "you have come at a most unfortunate time." Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. "Have I?" she asked. Mrs. Denham nodded. "Mr. Holridge. He passed away only 2 days ago." Miss Marple inclined her head. "How very sad." "Yes, though," Mrs. Denham added, lowering her voice slightly. "It was quite peaceful, they say." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "That is often what is said." Mrs. Denham hesitated. "There is nothing unusual about it, of course." Miss Marple looked at her. "Of course not. And yet—" She noticed something, not in the words themselves, but in the way they were spoken. A slight hesitation, a faint uncertainty. It was very small, but Miss Marple had always found that such things mattered. "Tell me," she said gently. "How was he found?" Mrs. Denham explained. The closed curtains, the visit, the doctor's conclusion. Miss Marple listened quietly. "Yes," she said at last. "Most unfortunate." She paused. "And no one thought it odd?" Mrs. Denham frowned slightly. "Odd?" "Yes." Mrs. Denham shook her head. "No. Why should they?" Miss Marple smiled. "No reason at all," she said. But as she sat by the window later that afternoon, watching the quiet movement of the village, she found herself thinking. A man found seated. No disturbance. No sign of struggle. A peaceful death. Yes, it was all very ordinary. And yet— Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the distant outline of Mr. Horridge's house. She had seen such things before, deaths that appeared simple, natural, unremarkable, until they were not. She folded her hands lightly in her lap. Yes, she thought. This might prove not restful at all. The ordinary pattern. Miss Marple had long ago learned that when something appears entirely ordinary, one must take particular care, not because it is certain to be otherwise, but because the assumption of simplicity so often prevents closer examination. In Eldercombe, everything about Mr. Halridge's death had been accepted with remarkable ease. Too much ease, perhaps. The following morning dawned clear and mild, the sort of day that encouraged routine rather than reflection. Miss Marple, however, was not inclined to allow matters to settle quite so comfortably. She took her breakfast with Mrs. Denham, listening with quiet attention to the flow of village conversation. "They say it was his heart," Mrs. Denham remarked, pouring tea. "Dr. Elmsley seemed quite certain." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Well, certain enough." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Certainty," she said, "is a most useful thing, though one must always be careful how it is arrived at." Mrs. Denham paused. "You think he might be mistaken?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I would not presume to say so," she replied. "Only that it is always interesting to consider the circumstances." After breakfast, Miss Marple expressed a desire for a short walk. "Fresh air does one good," she said. Mrs. Denham agreed readily, though she seemed faintly puzzled by the direction Miss Marple chose. Instead of the green, or the church lane, Miss Marple turned toward the edge of the village, toward Mr. Halridge's house. It stood as described, neat, well-kept, and entirely unremarkable. The curtains were now open, the windows clean. There was no visible sign that anything unusual had occurred within. Miss Marple paused at the gate, a small, practical gate, painted, maintained. She rested her hand lightly upon it. Yes, she thought, very orderly. She did not enter, not yet. Instead, she continued along the lane, observing. The path leading to the house was firm, as just slightly worn from regular use. The garden, though modest, was carefully tended. No wild growth, no neglect. Everything spoke of habit, of consistency. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Yes. Mr. Halridge had been a man of routine, and then she noticed something. It was not large, not immediately striking, but it was there. She bent slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. A faint mark near the edge of the path. Not a footprint exactly. More, a disturbance. Miss Marple regarded it for a moment longer, then she straightened. "Curious," she murmured, but she said nothing more. On her return to the village, she encountered Mrs. Wilton, who greeted her with interest. "Miss Marple, is it not?" she said. "I have heard you are visiting." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Yes." "You have come at a sad time," Mrs. Wilton continued. "So, I understand." Mrs. Wilton lowered her voice slightly. "It was very peaceful, they say." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Mrs. Wilton studied her for a moment. "You do not seem convinced." Miss Marple's smile did not change. "My dear Mrs. Wilton," she said gently, "I have found that what is described as peaceful is not always quite so simple." Mrs. Wilton looked intrigued. "You think something was wrong?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "I think," she said, "that there are one or two details which may be worth considering." Mrs. Wilton leaned forward slightly. "What sort of details?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Tell me, who saw Mr. Halridge last?" Mrs. Wilton considered. "Well, I believe it was Mr. Pritchard." "Mr. Pritchard?" "Yes, he lives just across the lane." "And he mentioned seeing Mr. Halridge the evening before." Miss Marple nodded. "And did he say anything unusual?" Mrs. Wilton shook her head. "No, only that Mr. Halridge seemed quite as usual." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "As usual," she repeated. "Yes." Miss Marple paused. "And no one visited him that evening?" Mrs. Wilton hesitated. "Well, not that I know of." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "Of course." The conversation moved on, as such conversations do, but Miss Marple had already noted what she required. Later that afternoon, she paid a visit to Dr. Elmsley. He received her with professional courtesy, though there was a trace of curiosity in his manner. "Miss Marple," he said, "I understand you are staying with Mrs. Denham. Yes. I trust you're comfortable. Very much so. Miss Marple seated herself. I hope you will not think me intrusive, she said, but I wish to ask you about Mr. Halridge. Dr. Elmsley nodded. A sad case. Yes, Miss Marple said, though a straightforward one, I believe. The doctor hesitated, just slightly. Yes, he said. There was no sign of anything untoward. No, no, Miss Marple regarded him quietly. And yet, she said gently, you did not issue a formal certificate immediately. Dr. Elmsley looked at her more closely. You are very observant, Miss Marple smiled. I try to be. He sighed faintly. It is merely procedure, he said. Nothing more. Of course, Miss Marple paused. And the position in which he was found? Dr. Elmsley frowned slightly. Yes. Seated, Miss Marple said. Quite naturally? Yes. And there was nothing displaced? No. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, she said. That is what I was told. She paused. And yet, she added softly, one might expect something, if the death had been sudden. Dr. Elmsley looked thoughtful. Yes, perhaps. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, she said. You believe there is something more? He asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe, she said, that there may be something not quite accounted for. She paused at the door. A pattern, she added. Dr. Elmsley frowned. A pattern? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. And with that, she left him. As she made her way back through the quiet streets of Eldicombe, her thoughts arranged themselves with careful precision. A man of routine. A death without disturbance, a path slightly marked, a doctor not entirely certain. Yes, the pattern was there, not obvious, not yet, but present. And Miss Marple knew, from long experience, that once a pattern begins to form, it rarely does so without reason. The house that kept its silence. Miss Marple had always believed that houses remembered, not in any mystical sense, but in a practical one. They held the habits of those who lived in them, the arrangement of furniture, the position of objects, the smallest of details. These things, when observed carefully, told a story. And Mr. Halridge's house, she felt certain, had not yet told its full one. It was on the following morning that Miss Marple found her opportunity. Mrs. Denham, who had by now grown quietly interested in her guest's observations, mentioned that Mrs. Carter had been asked to assist in putting the place in order. Such things must be done, she said, though I always think it rather hasty. Miss Marple agreed. Yes, she said, one does sometimes risk losing the most useful impressions. Mrs. Denham looked at her. You would like to see it, I suppose? Miss Marple smiled gently. If it is not inconvenient. It was arranged without difficulty. In villages, Miss Marple knew, curiosity, when expressed with sufficient delicacy, was rarely refused. Mr. Halridge's house was as she had expected, neat, ordered, unremarkable. Mrs. Carter greeted them with a certain solemnity. It feels strange, she said, as though he might come in at any moment. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, such places often do. They entered the sitting room. It was precisely as described. The chair near the window, the small table beside it, a book placed neatly where it might be resumed. Miss Marple paused just inside the doorway. She did not move at once, and instead she allowed her eyes to travel slowly across the room. Yes, very orderly. Too orderly, perhaps. Mrs. Carter busied herself with small tasks, adjusting a cushion, straightening a stack of papers. Miss Marple moved forward at last. This was where he was found, she asked. Yes, Mrs. Carter replied, just there. Miss Marple approached the chair. She looked at it carefully. It was positioned comfortably, not rigidly, not as though it had been arranged, and yet, she bent slightly, her gaze focusing on the armrest. There, the faintest impression, as though a hand had gripped it. Miss Marple straightened. Did he often sit here? She asked. Oh yes, Mrs. Carter said. Every evening. Miss Marple nodded. Routine again. She moved to the small table. The book lay open, its pages undisturbed. A pair of spectacles rested beside it. Miss Marple regarded them thoughtfully. Was he reading? She asked. So it seems. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Yes, that would be expected. And yet, she reached out and gently touched the edge of the book. The page was marked, but not turned. A pause. "How curious," she murmured. Mrs. Carter looked at her. "Is something wrong?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no," she said. "Not wrong." She paused. "Only slightly inconsistent." Mrs. Carter frowned. Miss Marple moved slowly around the room. Everything was in its place. Everything suggested calm. And yet there was something beneath it. A tension. A moment interrupted. She stopped near the window. It overlooked the garden. The same neat garden she'd observed before. Miss Marple looked down. The path. Yes. She turned back. "Was the window open?" she asked. Mrs. Carter considered. "I believe it was closed." Miss Marple nodded. "And the door?" "Closed as well." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Yes, very contained." She moved once more to the chair. "A man's sitting," she said softly. "Reading, quite at ease." Mrs. Carter nodded. "And then," Miss Marple continued, "he dies." A pause. "Without movement." Mrs. Carter shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. No disturbance, no sign of struggle. Another pause. "And yet—" She looked once more at the armrest. "There was a moment," she said quietly. Mrs. Carter looked at her. "A moment?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. "A moment when something was not as it should have been." She stepped back slightly. "A reaction." Mrs. Carter frowned. "But no one saw it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said. "No one did." She turned toward the door. "Tell me," she added, "did Mr. Halridge receive many visitors?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "Not particularly." "And the evening before?" Mrs. Carter hesitated. "I believe someone may have called." Miss Marple stopped. "May have?" "Yes. Mrs. Wilton mentioned seeing someone near the gate." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And did she say who?" Mrs. Carter shook her head. "No." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "That would fit." She moved toward the door. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Carter watched her. "You think something is wrong, don't you?" Miss Marple paused. She looked back at the quiet room, the chair, the book, the untouched order. "Yes," she said softly. "I think something is very wrong." Outside, the air felt clearer. Miss Marple stood for a moment, her gaze resting on the house. A man of habit, a quiet evening, a visitor, and a death that left no mark. Except the smallest one. A grip of the hand. A moment of awareness. Then, nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. Yes. The house had spoken, not loudly, but clearly enough. And what it had said was that this had not been a peaceful death. Not at all. The visitor at dusk. Miss Marple did not hurry. She never did, particularly when matters required thought rather than action. There was a tendency, she had often observed, for people to rush toward conclusions when presented with something unsettling. But truth, in her experience, did not respond well to haste. It required patience and attention. The information Mrs. Carter had provided was slight, but not insignificant. A visitor, seen near the gate, not identified. Such things, Miss Marple knew, were rarely accidental. That afternoon she set out once more, this time with a clearer purpose. If someone had visited Mr. Halridge on the evening before his death, then that visit must be understood. Not assumed, not dismissed. Understood. Mrs. Wilton, as it happened, required very little encouragement to speak. She received Miss Marple with interest, her eyes bright with curiosity. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "I was wondering when you might call." Miss Marple smiled. "You're very kind." They settled near the window, Mrs. Wilton's preferred position, from which she could observe the comings and goings of the village with quiet efficiency. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that you mentioned seeing someone near Mr. Halridge's house." Mrs. Wilton nodded at once. "Yes, the evening before he was found." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And you are quite certain of this?" "Quite." Miss Marple paused. "Would you mind telling me exactly what you saw?" Mrs. Wilton settled herself more comfortably, clearly pleased to be of assistance. "It was just before dusk," she began. "Not fully dark, but the light was fading." Miss Marple nodded. I happened to glance out, as I often do, Mrs. Wilton continued, and I saw someone at the gate. At the gate, Miss Marple repeated. Yes. Did they enter? Mrs. Wilton hesitated. I believe so. You are not certain? Well, I did not watch continuously, she admitted, but it seemed likely. Miss Marple considered this. And the person? Did you recognize them? Mrs. Wilton frowned slightly. No, that is to say, not clearly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. But you saw enough to form an impression? Yes. What sort of impression? Mrs. Wilton hesitated again. It was someone familiar, she said slowly. Not a stranger. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. In what way familiar? She asked. Mrs. Wilton tapped her fingers lightly against the arm of her chair. The way they moved, she said, the way they stood. It suggested someone I had seen before. Miss Marple nodded. And yet, you cannot say who it was. No? A pause. Miss Marple's voice softened. Was it a man? Or a woman? Mrs. Wilton looked uncertain. I think... a woman. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Yes, she said quietly. Mrs. Wilton leaned forward slightly. You believe it was important? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe, she said, that it may help us understand what happened. Mrs. Wilton considered this. Well, she said, whoever it was, they did not stay long. Miss Marple looked at her. How can you be sure? Because, Mrs. Wilton replied, the light was nearly gone when I next looked, and there was no one there. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. A short visit. That, too, was telling. She rose after a few moments. You've been most helpful, she said. Mrs. Wilton smiled. I am glad of it. Miss Marple left the house and walked slowly along the lane. A visitor at dusk. Familiar. Unidentified. Present shortly before the death. Yes, the pattern was becoming clearer, but not yet complete. She turned her steps next toward Mr. Pritchard's house. If anyone had seen more, noticed more, it would be someone who lived close by. Mr. Pritchard was a practical man. He greeted Miss Marple politely, though with less curiosity than Mrs. Wilton had shown. I understand you saw Mr. Horridge on the evening before his death, Miss Marple said. Yes, he replied. Nothing unusual about it. Miss Marple inclined her head. And at what time was that? Just after 6, I should say. And how did he appear? Perfectly normal. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said. So I have heard. She paused. And did you notice anyone visiting him later? Mr. Pritchard shook his head. No. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. You're quite certain? Yes. A pause. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. Of course. As she walked away, she considered the difference between the two accounts. Mrs. Wilton, observant, but not continuous. Mr. Pritchard, certain, but perhaps less attentive. Yes, it was often so. Truth did not always lie in what was said, but in how it was said. That evening Miss Marple sat once more by the window at Mrs. Denham's cottage. The light faded slowly over Eldicombe. Dusk, the same hour Mrs. Wilton had described. Miss Marple watched the shadows lengthen. Yes, it was a time of uncertainty, when shapes were less distinct, when familiar figures might not be immediately recognised. She folded her hands. A visitor had come, someone known, someone who did not wish to be clearly seen, and after that visit, Mr. Holridge had died, quietly, without disturbance. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Yes, that was the key. And not the death itself, but the visit. Because in that brief, unobserved interval, something had occurred. Something deliberate, something quiet, and something very carefully done. The shape of suspicion. Miss Marple slept well that night, not because her mind was at ease, but because it was occupied. There is, she had often found, a peculiar satisfaction in the presence of a puzzle. It lends structure to thought. It replaces vague unease with quiet purpose. By morning, the outline of the matter in Eldicombe had begun to take clearer form, not complete, but sufficient to guide the next step. She took breakfast with Mrs. Denham as before, accepting toast and tea with her usual mild appreciation. "You've been thinking about it," Mrs. Denham said, watching her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One does. in such cases. Mrs. Denham hesitated. You believe it was not natural? Miss Marple buttered her toast carefully before replying. I believe, she said, that there are elements which do not quite fit. Mrs. Denham leaned forward. What sort of elements? Miss Marple paused. A visitor, she said. At dusk, unidentified. Mrs. Denham frowned. Yes, I heard something of that. Miss Marple nodded. And the manner of death. But it was peaceful, Mrs. Denham insisted, though not strongly. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Yes, she said. That is what has been said. She took a sip of tea. But there was a moment, she added softly. Mrs. Denham blinked. A moment? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, a small one. Almost imperceptible, she paused. A reaction, she said. Mrs. Denham looked puzzled. Miss Marple did not elaborate. Instead, she set down her cup. I think, she said, that it would be useful to consider the people most closely connected to Mr. Halridge. Mrs. Denham nodded slowly. Yes, she said, that would make sense. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It usually does. Later that morning, Miss Marple began her quiet inquiries, not openly, not directly, but in the gentle, conversational manner she preferred. The first name that emerged, unsurprisingly, was Mr. Edwin Clark. Mr. Clark had been, by all accounts, Mr. Halridge's nearest acquaintance. Not a close friend, perhaps, but a regular companion. They had walked together, played chess, shared occasional meals. Miss Marple found him in his garden, tending to a row of carefully arranged plants. He greeted her politely, though with a certain reserve. Mr. Clark, Miss Marple said gently. I hope you will forgive the intrusion. He inclined his head. Not at all. Miss Marple paused. I understand that you knew Mr. Halridge rather well. Mr. Clark's expression did not change. As well as anyone did. Miss Marple nodded. And how did he seem, of late? Quite as usual, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said. So I have heard. A pause. And on the evening before his death. Mr. Clark's hand stilled slightly over the soil. I did not see him that evening, he said. Miss Marple observed him quietly. No. No. She inclined her head. Of course. She did not press further. Instead, she asked, Was he in good health? Mr. Clark hesitated. For a man of his age, yes. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. That is often sufficient. She thanked him and moved on. The next name was Mrs. Linton. A widow. Living alone. Known for her quiet manner and careful habits. Miss Marple found her in her sitting room sewing. Miss Marple, she said with a polite smile, you are visiting Mrs. Denham, I believe. Yes, Miss Marple seated herself. I wish to ask you about Mr. Halridge. Mrs. Linton's expression softened slightly. A sad loss, she said. Yes. Miss Marple paused. You knew him? A little. And recently? Mrs. Linton hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. In what way? Mrs. Linton lowered her eyes briefly. We spoke occasionally. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. A pause. And on the evening before his death? Mrs. Linton's hands tightened slightly on her sewing. I was at home, she said. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. Of course. She rose soon after. By the time she returned to Mrs. Denham's cottage, the morning had yielded what she required. Not answers, but something just as valuable. Differences, small ones, subtle, but present. That afternoon Miss Marple sat once more by the window. The village moved as it always did, quietly, predictably. And yet, beneath that surface, there was something else. She reviewed the details in her mind. Mr. Halridge, a man of routine, a visitor at dusk, familiar, unidentified. Mr. Clark, careful, reserved. Mrs. Linton, hesitant. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands. The shape of suspicion was forming, not sharply defined, not yet, but enough to suggest that this was no random act, no sudden impulse. It had been planned, quietly, carefully, by someone who understood not only Mr. Halridge, but the village itself. And in a place like Eldercombe, that could only mean one thing. The answer was already here, hidden in plain sight. What routine conceals? Miss Marple had often remarked Though rarely allowed, that routine was one of the most useful disguises in the world. People trusted it, they relied upon it, and because they relied upon it, they ceased to question it. In Eldacombe, routine had done its work very well indeed. That afternoon, Miss Marple did not seek new conversations. Instead, she remained quietly at Mrs. Denham's cottage, her knitting resting lightly in her hands as her thoughts arranged themselves with increasing clarity. The pieces were there. They had been, perhaps, from the beginning. But pieces alone did not make a picture. They required arrangement. "A man of habit," she murmured softly. Mr. Hulridge had lived by routine. Oh, he sat in the same chair, read at the same hour, kept his house in the same order. Yes. Which meant that any deviation, however small, was significant. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "The book," she said quietly. Mrs. Denham, who was seated opposite, looked up. "The book?" "Yes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was open," she said, "but not turned." Mrs. Denham frowned. "I'm afraid I don't follow." Miss Marple folded her hands. "A man reading," she said, "will turn the page." "Yes. And if he is interrupted, suddenly, he may stop mid-page." "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head. But Mr. Halridge's book was marked, deliberately. Mrs. Denham looked puzzled. "You mean he had finished the page?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I mean that the book had been arranged to appear as though he had." A pause. Mrs. Denham stared at her. "You think someone moved it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think," she said, "that someone wished the scene to appear undisturbed." The words settled quietly. Mrs. Denham drew a breath. "But why?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. "Because," she said softly, "it was not undisturbed." There was a silence. Then, "You believe he was aware?" Mrs. Denham said slowly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." A moment of awareness. Mrs. Denham shivered slightly, but there was no sign of struggle. "No," Miss Marple said. "And that is precisely the point." She paused. "If a man is taken entirely by surprise, there may be no struggle." Mrs. Denham looked at her. "You mean poison?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, "Something quick." A pause. "Something that allows little time for reaction." Mrs. Denham sat very still. "But then, how was it given?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That," she said, "is the next question." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned once more to the lane leading to Mr. Halridge's house. The light was softer now, the same hour Mrs. Wilton had described. Dusk. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes attentive. Yes, this was the moment. The visitor had come at this hour, not too early, not too late, a time when observation was imperfect, when recognition might fail. She paused at the gate once more, and this time she opened it. The garden lay quiet. Miss Marple walked along the path, her gaze lowered slightly. There. The faint disturbance she had noticed before, more visible now in the slanting light. Not a clear footprint, but enough to suggest. A pause. Someone standing, waiting perhaps. Miss Marple followed the line of the path. Yes, someone had come here. Not in haste, not casually, but with purpose. She turned her gaze toward the house. The windows reflected the fading light. Closed. Contained. Miss Marple stood very still. A visitor arrives. A brief interval. A man seated, reading. Something is given. Quickly, quietly. A reaction. A grip of the hand. And then stillness. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Yes, that was how it had happened. But one question remained. Not how, but why, because method alone was never enough. As she left the garden, she encountered Mr. Clark once more. While he was walking along the lane, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Marple," he said. "Mr. Clark." A pause. "You have been taking an interest," he said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have." He hesitated. "You believe there was something wrong?" Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "Yes," she said. Mr. Clark's gaze shifted briefly toward the house. "He was a good man," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Another pause. Then, "He did not deserve—" Mr. Clark began and stopped. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "No," she said softly. He did not. Mr. Clark looked at her. For a moment it seemed he might say more, but he did not. He inclined his head slightly and walked on. Miss Marple watched him go. Yes, there was something there, not guilt, but knowledge. She turned back toward the village. The pattern was clearer now. The method, understood. The moment, identified. Only the motive remained, and Miss Marple knew, from long experience, that motive, in such cases, was never simple. It lay, not in the act itself, but in what had come before. Something quiet, something long held, something that had waited for exactly this moment to act. What the village remembers. Miss Marple had always maintained that villagers possessed a memory far more reliable than any written record. It was not organised, nor particularly logical. It existed instead in fragments, remarks made in passing, impressions formed without intention, recollections half forgotten until something stirred them into life again. In Eldacombe, that memory was beginning to speak. Miss Marple did not seek out the most obvious sources that morning. She had already spoken to those closest to Mr. Halridge. Their words had been careful, too careful perhaps. Useful, certainly, but shaped by awareness. No, what she required now was something less deliberate, something unguarded. She found it, as she often did, in the most ordinary of places, the village shop. Mrs. Carter was behind the counter, engaged in conversation with a young delivery boy, who was recounting, with unnecessary detail, the difficulties of managing a cart along the narrower lanes. Miss Marple waited patiently. There was no need to interrupt. Eventually the boy departed, and Mrs. Carter turned with a welcoming smile. "Miss Marple, how can I help you?" "Only a few small things," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "and perhaps a little conversation, if you have the time." Mrs. Carter laughed softly. In this village, one always has time for that. Miss Marple selected a few items, more for form than necessity, and allowed the conversation to unfold naturally. "It has been a strange few days," Mrs. Carter said, lowering her voice slightly. "Everyone is still talking about it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, such things tend to linger." Mrs. Carter leaned in slightly. "There has been some discussion." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "Indeed?" "Well," Mrs. Carter said, hesitating just enough to suggest both caution and curiosity, "about who might have visited him." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And what is being said?" Mrs. Carter glanced briefly toward the door, though no one stood there. "Some think it may have been Mrs. Linton." Miss Marple did not react outwardly. "Mrs. Linton?" she repeated. "Yes. And why do they think so, Mrs.?" Carter lowered her voice further. She had been calling on him from time to time. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I gathered as much." And she was seen walking that way that evening. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Seen by whom?" Mrs. Carter hesitated. "I believe it was young Henry Wilkes. He was coming back from the far lane." Miss Marple considered this. "And did he say he saw her enter the house?" "No," Mrs. Carter admitted. "Only that she was heading in that direction." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "That is often enough for people to form a conclusion." Mrs. Carter looked slightly embarrassed. "Well, you know how it is." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I do." She gathered her purchases. "And what do you think?" she asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated. "I think," she said slowly, that Mrs. Linton is not the sort to do such a thing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "No," she said, "she's not." The certainty in her tone seemed to surprise Mrs. Carter. "You're quite sure?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, yes." She paused. "But that does not mean she knows nothing." Miss Marple left the shop and walked slowly along the green. The pieces were shifting now. Mrs. Linton, seen near the house, a visitor at dusk, possibly a woman. Yes, it was beginning to align. But something remained unsettled. Miss Marple stopped briefly near the churchyard, her gaze resting on the quiet rows of stones. "No," she murmured. Something was not quite right. She turned her thoughts carefully over. If Mrs. Linton had visited, then why the hesitation? Why the guarded manner? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Because There was a difference between being present and being responsible. She resumed walking. The next step was clear. Mrs. Linton must be spoken to again, but this time, not about the obvious, about the past. She found Mrs. Linton at home once more, seated as before, her sewing in her lap. Miss Marple was received politely, though with a trace of unease that had not been present during their first meeting. "I hope I am not intruding," Miss Marple said. "Not at all," Mrs. Linton replied. Miss Marple seated herself. "I wish to ask you something further," she said gently. Mrs. Linton's hands tightened slightly. "Yes?" Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "You were seen walking toward Mr. Halridge's house on the evening before his death." The words were simple, but their effect was immediate. Mrs. Linton's gaze dropped. Yes, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you," she said. A pause. "And did you visit him?" Mrs. Linton hesitated. "Yes." Miss Marple waited. "It was only a short visit," Mrs. Linton added quickly. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "So I have heard." Another pause. Mrs. Linton looked at her. "You think it was important?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think it may help us understand." Mrs. Linton's expression grew troubled. "There was nothing unusual," she said. Miss Marple did not respond at once. Instead, she asked, "What did you speak of?" Mrs. Linton hesitated again. "Nothing of consequence." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "No?" Mrs. Linton shook her head. "No." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke very gently. "And yet you have not mentioned this before, Mrs." Linton's composure faltered. "I did not think it necessary." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "That is often the case." She rose. "Thank you," she added. Mrs. Linton looked at her, uncertain. "You do not believe me?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I believe," she said, "that you have told me part of the truth." Mrs. Linton's breath caught. "And the rest?" she asked. Miss Marple paused at the door. "The rest," she said softly, "will become clear." Outside, the air felt cooler. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the green. Yes, the village remembered, in fragments, in impressions, in things half said and half seen. And now, those fragments were coming together. Mrs. Linton had been there. That was certain. But whether she had stayed, whether she had acted, that remained to be seen. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. Because somewhere, between what had been said and what had been withheld, lay the truth, waiting, as it always did, to be uncovered. What was left unfinished? Miss Marple did not immediately return to Mrs. Linton after their conversation. There was no need. One learned, over time, that truth did not always emerge under direct pressure. Indeed, it often retreated from it. No, what was required now was reflection. Not only on what Mrs. Linton had said, but on what she had not. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon quietly, her knitting resting in her lap as her thoughts moved carefully from one detail to another. A visit, admitted at last, but described as ordinary. Inconsequential, Mrs. Linton had said. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. There was no such thing, not in a village. For not when a man was dead. Yes, she murmured softly, it is never inconsequential. Mrs. Denham, who had grown accustomed to such remarks, did not question her. "You have discovered something," she said instead. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I believe I have discovered a gap." "A gap?" "Yes." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "We know that Mrs. Linton visited Mr. Halridge," she said, "and that the visit was brief." "Yes." "And that after she left, at some point, he died." Mrs. Denham frowned. "You think she's responsible?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "No," she said, "I do not." Mrs. Denham looked surprised. "But she was there." "Yes." "And she did not tell anyone." "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Which makes her important," she said, "but not necessarily guilty." A pause. Mrs. Denham considered this. "Then what is the gap?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window where the light had begun once more to soften toward evening. "The moment after she left," she said quietly. There was a silence. Mrs. Denham looked at her. "You think someone else came?" Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. The simplicity of the answer seemed to alter the entire shape of the matter. But Mrs. Wilton only saw one person, Mrs. Denham said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mrs. Wilton saw someone, she corrected gently. A pause. Not necessarily the only one. Mrs. Denham stared at her. You mean there were 2 visits? Miss Marple nodded. I think it very likely. She rose slowly and moved toward the window. The village lay quiet, unchanged, and yet everything had changed. Consider, Miss Marple said softly, the nature of the first visit. Mrs. Denham listened. Mrs. Linton arrives, Miss Marple continued. She speaks with Mr. Halridge. Something unsettles her, enough that she does not later mention the visit. Mrs. Denham nodded slowly. Yes. But she leaves, Miss Marple said. And Mr. Halridge remains alive. A pause. Mrs. Denham's breath caught slightly. Yes. Miss Marple turned back toward her. And then, she said, someone else comes. The room felt suddenly colder. Someone who knew, Mrs. Denham said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. Knew what? Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. That something had already begun, she said. Something that could not be allowed to continue. Mrs. Denham stared at her. You think Mrs. Linton told someone? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, she said. I think someone saw. A silence followed. Miss Marple continued softly. In villages, my dear Mrs. Denham, very little goes entirely unnoticed. Mrs. Denham considered this. Yes, she said slowly, that is true. Miss Marple resumed her seat. So, she said, we have a second visitor. A pause. One who came after Mrs. Linton. Mrs. Denham leaned forward. And this person, this second visitor, Miss Marple finished gently, was the one who acted. The words settled heavily. But why? Mrs. Denham asked. Miss Marple's gaze lowered slightly. Because something had been left unfinished. A pause. Mrs. Denham frowned. I don't understand. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Mrs. Linton's visit disturbed the balance, she said. It brought something into motion. What sort of thing? Miss Marple hesitated. A memory, she said at last. The word lingered. A past connection, she continued. Something shared, something known. Mrs. Denham's expression changed. You mean Mr. Halridge knew something? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. And Mrs. Linton reminded him of it. Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she said, she brought it to the surface. A silence followed. And someone else, Mrs. Denham said slowly, could not allow that. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes. The pattern was clearer now, not complete, but unmistakable. 2 visits, one to speak, one to silence. Miss Marple folded her hands, because now the method was understood, the sequence clear. Only one question remained. Who had come second? And why had they been so certain that no one would notice? Miss Marple's gaze returned once more to the quiet village outside. Yes, that was always the mistake. In places like Eldercombe, people believed that nothing could be hidden. And yet, the truth was often the opposite. It was not what was seen, but what was assumed, that allowed things to remain hidden, for a time, but not forever. The second visitor, Miss Marple, had always maintained that once a pattern revealed itself, the final steps were often the simplest, though not always the easiest to accept. In Eldercombe, the pattern now stood clearly before her. 2 visits, one acknowledged, one hidden, and between them, a death. That morning, the village appeared as calm as ever. Children crossed the green, a cart passed slowly along the lane, voices carried in the mild air. Nothing, to an outsider, would suggest that anything unusual had taken place. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen such calm before. It was not the absence of disturbance, but the result of it. She set out once more, this time with quiet certainty. There was no need now for speculation, only confirmation. Her first call was not to Mrs. Linton. That conversation, she felt, had given all it could. No. The second visitor would not be found through hesitation, but through observation. Miss Marple walked toward the far end of the village where the houses stood slightly more apart, their gardens a little larger, their occupants a little more private. There she found Mr. Edwin Clark again. He was not in his garden this time. Instead, he stood near the gate as though he had been expecting someone, or perhaps avoiding being indoors. "Miss Marple," he said, her as she approached. "Mr. Clark." There was a pause. "You have been asking questions," he said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes." He regarded her for a moment. "And have you found your answers?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I believe I am close." Mr. Clark's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he said. A silence followed. Miss Marple did not hurry it. Instead, she said, "Mrs. Linton visited Mr. Holridge on the evening before his death." Mr. Clark's gaze did not change. "So I understand." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "And she left." "Yes." Another pause. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but she was not the last to see him alive. For the first time, Mr. Clark's composure shifted, only slightly, but enough. Miss Marple continued. "There was a second visitor, Mr." Clark said nothing. Miss Marple took a small step closer. "One who came after Mrs. Linton." The silence deepened. "And that person," Miss Marple said gently, "knew that something had already been set in motion." Mr. Clark's hands tightened at his sides. "You're making assumptions," he said. Miss Marple shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm observing." A pause. "You saw her," Miss Marple continued quietly. Mr. Clark looked at her sharply. "Saw Mrs. Linton," Miss Marple said. The word settled. "You live directly across the lane," she went on. "You're in the habit of observing your surroundings." Mr. Clark did not deny it. "You saw her approach the house," Miss Marple said, "and you saw her leave." A long silence followed. "Yes," Mr. Clark said at last. The admission was quiet, but it was enough. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "And after she left," she continued, "you went to the house." Mr. Clark's breath caught slightly. "You had not intended to," Miss Marple added gently, "but something about the visit disturbed you." Mr. Clark looked away. "I thought," he began, then stopped. Miss Marple waited. "I thought something was wrong," he said at last. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." "And when you entered," she continued, "you found Mr. Halridge alive." Mr. Clark's voice was low. "Yes." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "And he spoke to you?" Another silence. "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And what did he say?" Mr. Clark closed his eyes briefly. "He said, 'It had been a long time,' he said." Miss Marple said nothing. "He said he had been waiting," Mr. Clark continued, a pause. "And that things should be put right." The words hung in the air. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "Yes," she said, "and you understood what he meant." Mr. Clark's expression hardened slightly. "Yes." Miss Marple took a small breath. He was not speaking only of the present, she said, but of something that had happened before. Mr. Clark did not answer. Miss Marple continued. "Something in which you were involved." A silence fell. Then, "Yes," Mr. Clark said. The word was quiet, but final. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I thought as much." She paused. "And so," she continued, "you realized that he intended to speak." Mr. Clark's hands tightened. "Yes." "And that if he did, the truth would come out." "Yes." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "And you could not allow that." The silence that followed was heavy. Mr. Clark did not deny it. He did not speak at all, but in that silence, the truth was already present. Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. "Yes," she said softly. "That is how it happened." Because sometimes it is not the act itself, but the moment before it, that reveals everything. And now, that moment had been found. The truth brought into light. Miss Marple did not speak at once. She had never believed in rushing such moments. Truth once uncovered required space to be acknowledged, and perhaps to be born. Mr. Clark stood very still by the gate, his gaze no longer defensive but distant, as though he were looking not at the present but at something far behind it. "It was a long time ago," he said at last. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, Those are often the things that matter most. A faint, humourless smile touched his lips. You make it sound inevitable. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. In a way, she said, it is. He drew a slow breath. We were not always as we are now, he said. Halridge and I? Miss Marple said nothing. There was a business, he continued, years ago, before either of us came here. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. A partnership, she said softly. Mr. Clark nodded. Yes. He paused. It failed, he said. Not openly, not at once, but there were irregularities. Miss Marple did not move. Money, Mr. Clark said. Missing, misplaced. It was never proved. A silence followed. But it was true, he added quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. Mr. Clark looked away. It was I who took it, he said. The admission came without emphasis, without defence. Miss Marple did not react outwardly. And Mr. Halridge knew, she said. Yes. Another pause. But he said nothing, Mr. Clark continued. Not then. He allowed the matter to disappear. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Why? Mr. Clark hesitated. I think, he said slowly, that he believed I would make it right. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. But I did not, Mr. Clark said. A faint tension returned to his voice. I came here, he came here, and we continued as though nothing had happened. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she said, that is often the way of such things. Mr. Clark's gaze hardened slightly. Until, he said, Mrs. Linton came. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Yes. She knew, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Not everything, she said, but enough. Mr. Clark nodded. She spoke to him, he said, reminded him. A pause. And when she left, Miss Marple said softly, you knew that the past would not remain buried. Yes, Mr. Clark's voice grew quieter. He told me, he said, when I went in, he said it must be put right, that he could not carry it any longer. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Yes, she said. And you understood what that meant, she added. Mr. Clark closed his eyes briefly. Yes. A long silence followed. Miss Marple spoke at last. You had little time, she said. Little opportunity. Mr. Clark nodded. And yet, Miss Marple continued, you had already prepared. He looked at her sharply. You had something with you, she said. Something quick, something certain. Mr. Clark did not deny it. It was not planned for that evening, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. No, she said, but it was planned. A pause. Mr. Clark's voice was steady now. I had thought. Perhaps I would speak to him, persuade him. Miss Marple said nothing. But when he told me... Mr. Clark stopped. Miss Marple finished quietly. That he would speak. Yes. Another silence. And so, Miss Marple said gently, you gave it to him. Mr. Clark nodded. In his tea, he said. The words fell with quiet finality. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. He did not suspect, Mr. Clark added. No, Miss Marple said. He trusted you. The truth of that seemed to strike him more deeply than anything else. I did not mean, he began, then stopped. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. You did not mean to be discovered, she said. Mr. Clark let out a slow breath. No. Miss Marple looked toward the house in the distance. You arranged the room, she said. The book, the stillness. Yes. So that it would appear natural? Yes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And for a time, she said, it did. A faint, weary expression crossed Mr. Clark's face. Yes. Another silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke once more. But there was one thing you could not arrange, she said. Mr. Clark looked at her. The moment, she said. A pause. The reaction, she continued. The instinctive movement. The grip of the hand. Mr. Clark said nothing. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. That is what revealed it, she said. The words were not accusatory. They were simply true. Mr. Clark bowed his head slightly. Yes, he said. The quiet of the lane seemed deeper now. Miss Marple folded her hands. It is always so, she said softly. What is? He asked. That the smallest thing, she replied, is often the most difficult to conceal. A long silence followed. At last Mr. Clark spoke. What will happen now? Miss Marple regarded him calmly. That, she said, is no longer a matter for me. She paused. But the truth, she added, has a way of making itself known. Mr. Clark nodded slowly. Yes, he said. And in that moment, there was no longer any doubt. The quiet village of Eldercombe had yielded its secret. Not through force, not through chance, but through the careful observation of what others had overlooked. And now, only one thing remained, to bring it fully into the light, or the quiet ending. In villages like Eldercombe, the end of a matter rarely arrives with noise. There are no sudden revelations shouted across crowded rooms, no dramatic confrontations before assembled witnesses. Instead, truth settles gently, almost reluctantly into its proper place, and once it has done so, life resumes, not unchanged, but adjusted. Miss Marple did not take any direct action following her conversation with Mr. Clark. That, she felt, would have been both unnecessary and inappropriate. The truth had been spoken. That was enough. It was Dr. Elmsley who came to call the following morning. He was more serious than Miss Marple had yet seen him, his usual professional composure tinged now with something heavier. I believe, he said, after the briefest of formalities, that I owe you an apology. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Not at all. I was too ready to accept the obvious, he continued, too willing to trust appearances. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It is a very human tendency. Dr. Elmsley hesitated. Mr. Clark has made a statement, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, she said. He came to me early this morning, the doctor went on, quite calmly, quite completely. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she said softly. That would be like him. Dr. Elmsley looked at her. You knew he would do so. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, he had reached the point where there was nothing left to conceal. The doctor drew a breath. It is a dreadful thing, he said. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. There was a pause, then, and Mrs. Linton? Dr. Elmsley asked. Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. She did nothing wrong, she said, though she may feel that she did. Yes, the doctor said. She's been quite distressed. Miss Marple inclined her head. That is understandable. Dr. Elmsley rose after a moment. I am grateful, he said, that you chose to look more closely. Miss Marple smiled gently. It was not a choice, she said, merely a habit. When he had gone, Miss Marple remained seated for some time, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Outside, the village moved as it always had, unhurried, measured, familiar. Later that day she took a final walk, not with purpose, but with reflection. She passed the green, where children played as though nothing at all had occurred. She passed the shop, where conversation had already begun to shift toward more ordinary matters, and at last she came to the lane where Mr. Halridge's house stood. It looked unchanged, as though it had quietly resumed its place within the village. Miss Marple paused at the gate. For a moment she allowed herself to remember. The man who had lived there, quiet, orderly, patient. A man who had carried a truth for many years, until, at last, he could carry it no longer. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly, it is always so. She thought too of Mr. Clark, not with anger, but with a kind of weary understanding. Fear, she knew, was rarely sudden. It grew, quietly, over time, until it became something that could no longer be ignored, and when that moment came, people did not always act as they believed they would. Miss Marple turned away from the house. There was nothing more to be seen there, nothing more to be understood. That evening she sat once more by the window at Mrs. Denham's cottage. The light faded slowly over Eldercombe, just as it had on the evening when everything had begun. Dusk, the hour of uncertainty, the hour when shapes blurred and truths were not yet fully visible. Miss Marple watched it quietly, and then, as the last of the light slipped away, she spoke. In the end, she said softly, it is never the act itself that matters most. Mrs. Denham, seated nearby, looked at her. What do you mean? Miss Marple's gaze remained on the darkening village. It is what leads to it, she said. The choices, the silences, the things left unsaid. A pause. And the smallest detail, she added, which refuses to be forgotten. Mrs. Denham was silent for a moment. Then, "It seems very sad," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said, "it is." The room grew quiet. Outside, Eldicombe settled into night, and though the truth had been uncovered, though the pattern had been seen, though the secret had been brought into the light, there remained, as there always did, a sense of something unresolved. Not in fact, but in feeling. Because no matter how clearly a mystery is solved, the lives it touches are never quite the same again. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Yes, she thought, that, above all, was the true nature of such things. Not the puzzle, not the solution, but the quiet, lasting change that followed. And in that quiet, Eldicombe endured, as villagers always do, holding its secrets until the next time one chose to look a little closer.